Jeez, this solid gray background is as dull as...
Hey Cody, glad you can make it.
Yeah, so did you tell the viewers this is only part 2 of 4?
I figured the title made that obvious.
Oh, silly smaller channel, so blissfully ignorant of protocol.
My channel was around before yours.
Part 1 of this alternate history timeline is on a video on my channel, which is linked in the description. There will also be a part 3 on my channel, with part 4 back on this channel.
Yep. Anywho, so last time, to sum things up, the South broke away, they took Cuba, most of northern Mexico, causing a second...
Don't give too much away, buddy.
So the next 3 books are set almost 2 generations later, after the last book. The United States has now lost 2 wars against the South, and they're as bitter as ever. The entangling alliances that led up to World War I in our timeline still exist here, except now they include the United States as the central power and the Confederacy as an ally of Britain and France. We start with the outbreak of World War I, and so naturally the USA and CSA get dragged in. By the way, the US president is Theodore Roosevelt, who's a Democrat. Since both presidents who fought the South and lost were Republicans, the Republican Party has become a minor party, and the Democrats have essentially won every single presidency up to this point so far, although that'll change in part 3. The Confederate president is Woodrow Wilson, who's a Whig. Yes, the Whigs are back, except this time in the South. And similar to the Democrats in the North, the Whigs are dominating the Confederacy. What's life in the South like in the 1910s? Well, the slaves have been free for a long time, but are essentially still slaves in everything but name. They're still not treated like humans with rights, and they're not happy about it, which is an important detail because that'll come back later. As for the North, the amount of bitterness is high. The anniversary of their defeat back in the Second Mexican War was a yearly event of remembrance. They wanted vengeance, once and for all, so naturally they were eager to get the Great War started. However, the South ended up launching the first offensive. They try to imitate Robert E. Lee and capture Philadelphia like how they won independence back in 1862. Except naturally, the trench warfare kind of makes that a bit hard, and the trench warfare is everywhere because it's World War I. When the US forces try to invade Confederate-held Kentucky, again, trench warfare makes it kind of a nightmare. However, to make matters worse, the US also has to deal with British Canada up north. Along that border, which has essentially been fortified, the fighting is a bit more sporadic, but the US eventually breaks through and captures most important Canadian towns along the border. In Europe, the war goes the exact same, because we didn't enter World War I in our timeline until 1917. But what happens when we get to 1917? Well, truth be told, the US entered the war at a good time in our timeline. French troops in 1917 began a few mutinies, and there were huge worries that France would drop out if the soldiers would refuse to fight. Luckily, American intervention calmed them down, as finally they were going to have the manpower to push forward. Here? Well, the US certainly isn't coming. The CSA did not send any forces either, because they have to deal with the United States invading their country. So the mutinies in this timeline become so great that France simply can't take it anymore and agrees to make peace with the Central Powers. Russia, like in our timeline, drops out because of the Russian Revolution, and so Britain and the Confederacy are the only ones left. However, eventually the US breaks through Confederate defenses. Why? Well, George Armstrong Custer. Yes, Custer. Due to the US going AWOL against the Native Americans after they lost against the South, after all, they did not want to have to deal with another enemy, there was never a Battle of Little Bighorn. Custer lived and remained in the army since then. He was around in the original Southern War of Independence and was now an old man who had become an armchair general. But he also helped come up with a new revolutionary device. Custer was a cavalryman and wanted to find a way to combine cavalry and artillery. He came up with a barrel. You all know this device as a tank. But that name was given because the British called their device a tank to fool the Germans into thinking it was a device that held water. Here the Americans invent it first, and they have the same general idea, but the American name for a giant container of water is a barrel, not a tank. So that's the proper name for this vehicle from now on. These barrels' firepower, along with cavalry-style tactics, would be what breaks the Confederate front lines, and the US advances all around. They gain ground in Sonora, Sequoia, West Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, and even penetrate past Kentucky and down into Tennessee. How could it possibly get worse? Remember those not slaves yet totally slaves I mentioned earlier? With the military effort of the Confederacy collapsing, they took advantage of this. They rebelled. To make matters more frightening for the South, the philosophies of Karl Marx had much influence on the disgruntled African American population. So they rose up and declared several independent socialist republics. The Confederacy was able to suppress all these efforts after around 2 years, but that cost them essential military men, supplies, and time that could have been used to try and stop the US from advancing further. Because of this, the Confederacy, and also eventually the UK, can no longer fight and are forced to make peace. The Central Powers have won World War I. While the war takes up most of the story here, the peace treaty is the most important part. The US had finally won against their rival in the South. Their hunger for revenge was about to be satisfied. What were they going to do? Well, you know how the Treaty of Versailles essentially did all it could to humiliate and destroy the spirit of Germany after World War I? Imagine that, but for the Allies. So let's do this one by one. France. They lost a few colonies to Germany, and more land from Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. They didn't really need anything else though. Germany had humiliated them for the second time in 50 years, that was good enough. Russia. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed just like in our timeline, where they lost huge chunks of land. Except this time, since Germany won World War I, it stays in place. So now Germany and Austria-Hungary dominate Eastern Europe. The Bolsheviks are also not a thing. The Germans don't want to deal with that, so they actually use their troops there to help the Russian monarchists kill off the Bolshevik forces. Now Russia itself was practically dependent on Germany. Britain. They lost a few colonies to the European Central Powers, but for the United States, they lost more. Way more. The US was not happy about how the British twice stopped them from being the South. So they take Hawaii from them, and the Bahamas, and Bermuda, and the biggest prize of all, British Canada. Wait a minute, you may ask. All of Canada? That's a bit much, don't you think? Actually, it's not. Canada wasn't really developed much past the southern border area, other than the occasional town and railroad. The US during the war captured nearly all of these important areas. What use would Britain have for the rest of it? Even with the resources there, without these southern areas, they couldn't sustain a colony here. So now all of it is under US military occupation, except for Quebec. In order to relieve some pressure on US occupation forces, the US gives Quebec independence as the Republic of Quebec. The Republic of Quebec is essentially an American puppet state. If any of you think this is cliche, it's really not. Quebec back then had a lot of separatist movements. They voted on it twice in the late 1900s even. So wow, the US got a lot from Britain. How about the South? Well, the South was humiliated. Any land they took during the war was essentially theirs by right of conquest. A chunk of Northern Virginia was given to West Virginia. Kentucky is taken back into the Union. Sequoia is under US occupation. Parts of Sonora are annexed to New Mexico. Western Texas is broken off, and it becomes the US state of Houston, even though Houston is not in Houston. Once again, good job with the naming. The South was definitely humiliated. One disgruntled soldier is horrified by this. He wants to bring back the South's glory. He's also mad at the African Americans who rebelled earlier, claiming that they stabbed the South in the back. He'll be back in the next set of books, ready to bring his mad visions to life. His name is Jake Featherstone. Okay, sorry, I can never find that name intimidating, but you'll learn more about him in part 3.
I'm back!
Oh hey, how'd you enjoy part 2?
Huh? What? Oh, yeah, trenches and bullets and stuff.
Anywho.
Ha ha ha! Next part is mine. Part 3 is back on my channel, coming about a week after this one.
Does that mean...
We'll talk about it later.
Well, you heard it here, folks. This complex timeline continues. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to see more videos, and be sure to subscribe to Alternate History Hub so you can catch the next part and see his awesome videos over other alternate history timelines.